Hey, good morning also from my side. I think I'll remove this. That makes me a bit movable. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. Just to sort of warn you in advance, there's very little good news I have to share. This is sort of part of the issue I'm talking about. And maybe for those who are not from Germany, it's a different Germany I would like to invite you to have a look at, because I have followed the international sort of press releases on Germany and how welcome Germany was and all. That is one part of the story, but there is also another part of the story which I would like to share with you today. And just to pick up with a word I just heard is that we want to share the burden sort of amongst all shoulders. It's interesting that when we talk about refugees, we forget that it's not a burden we're all sharing, but it's actually a human rights obligation our states have agreed to. And that is something I really need you all to keep in mind. It's not sort of, we are not very charitable, we're not generous, whatever. It's a very simple human rights obligation that all our states have agreed to. And Germany, and I think that's good that we went back to history today, Germany was one of the reasons why, for example, the UN was created so fast, because Germany was one of the biggest refugee-producing countries. So we have a historical obligation and we have a legal obligation. So it's not about generosity, but about a human rights obligation that we all share. So today, and maybe one more word you will not hear from me is refugee crisis. When I hear this word, I get very irritated, to be honest, because if at all we have a crisis of the state. Because it was not that, it was September and millions of people just jumped into the country. We knew this was happening. There were many international agencies telling Europe what's happening, and Europe decided to wait. So if we're talking for crisis, we're talking about a state crisis and not a refugee crisis. I don't want to be too picky on words, but sometimes words do sort of show a concept that is sort of problematic in this field. But now let's get back to what I mean with human rights or social work as a human rights profession. The colleague today morning talked about Jane Addams. I don't know where you are right now, but we heard about Jane Addams, and Jane Addams is actually one of the persons Sylvia Staubmeier-Kuhn has traced back as one of the social workers who sort of started doing social work as a human rights profession long before the UN was created. So I think we have a long history of social workers, usually women, let's not forget that, who actually were pioneers of social work and who actually had the idea of social work as a human rights profession. So if you talk about social work as a human rights profession today, it's basically on different levels. First of all, it's about human rights as a frame of reference on the level of the profession. I'll talk about that very briefly. Then human rights as an instrument for analyzing. I'll talk about that a little more. Then human rights as a frame of reference or orientation, especially towards demands that are not compatible with the mandate of social work. And that is something I'm really worried about these days. So I will also talk about human rights violations in social work. So if you're talking about social work as a human rights profession, it's also important to talk about how are we violating human rights of people. And social work as a political stakeholder. I have no good news on that. And the last issue is the use of the UN human rights protection system as a method in professional social work. I will not talk about that today just because of time issues. So when we're talking about sort of as a frame of reference, I guess all of you are familiar with these documents. I will not repeat them, but you can see it's only 6 documents I have listed up here. But we have a whole list of many, many more documents that are very clear on these points. First of all, they say that the reference to human rights in social work is not a question of choice, but it is a fundamental element of social work. So if I'm a professional social worker, I don't have the choice, do I agree to the human rights or not? Basically, it is fundamental to professional social work. And I've put it in brackets, but it's very important. None of these documents talk about national law. This is very, very important, because if we keep in mind why human rights were created to sort of protect us all from our governments. So it's a bit ridiculous to say human rights are there to protect me from my government. On the same hand, I have to stick to what this government has agreed on. So all these international documents talk about human rights and not about national rights. Then, obviously, social work itself has to comply with human rights standards. such as anti-discrimination, which is just one issue. So it's very easy to complain about the human rights violation of others, but it's not that easy to see, are we actually complying to human rights in our everyday work? And anti-discrimination is just one word, but I could talk like for 10 hours on how anti-discrimination is a non-issue in many fields of social work. Then these documents are very clear that social work has a political mandate. We'll talk about that a bit later. And obviously having a political mandate means that we have a mandate for individual change and support, but also for structural change. And I think that is very important if you're talking about human rights abuses. Obviously human rights abuses are often something that one person occurs, but more often a human rights abuse is a structural abuse of a situation. So we would need structural change for a situation that seems individual on the first sight. So what are we talking about, sort of a mandate of social work? So if you talk about social work as a human rights profession, we have to talk about the mandate. Yeah, so what is the mandate that a social worker has? What is the self-understanding of the mandate? Many social workers, actually when I studied, I was taught that social work has a double mandate. Basically, one mandate comes from the service user, and the other mandate comes from my employer, agency, state. That's what I learned. So I can work with a mandate or self-understanding of a mandate with a double sort of mandate. But if I consider social work as a human rights profession, I would need to sort of expand my mandate to a third mandate, which is basically based, again, on two small mandates. One would be the scientifically based basing of methods, and everything that I do needs to be compatible with the International Code of Ethics of Social Work. This is not my idea, unfortunately, but it's the idea of Staub and Asconi, who in 2007 clearly said, well, if you work with a triple mandate, you also have the choice to accept duties, but also to deny duties. And I think that is very, very important, because we know that social workers can be misused as very powerful stakeholders to actually violate other people's rights. So if I have a mandate understanding that I have a third mandate that is always compatible with the International Code of Ethics, I have the right to refuse specific demands, but I also have the right to give myself a new mandate, sort of to think, what do I think is good for this person, then obviously talk to the person and decide whether he or she wants me to follow this mandate or not. So if you're talking about social work as a human rights profession, we need to talk about the third mandate. So these sort of for the slides on social work, basically, human rights as a basis from the profession. So what do I mean about human rights as an instrument for analyzing? And now you'll get a small insight in the other Germany. I just picked up two human rights documents. The ICCPR is a covenant on civil and political rights, and the other covenant is on economic, social, and cultural rights. So it's just two conventions I've looked up and the situation in Germany. Again, on this issue, I could sort of talk for hours. I will not do that today, so just that you get an idea of what I actually mean. We all, and that is again very important, human rights are based only on one standard, and the standard is you need to be a human being. So it makes no difference, am I legal, am I illegal, am I German, am I non-German? That is absolutely irrelevant. So we all who are in Germany have a right to adequate, or any of your countries I would guess, right to adequate housing and standard of living. But refugees are supposed to, as soon as they apply for asylum in Germany, they have to move into asylum seekers accommodation. These are sort of very problematic. I'll give you an insight of what they sometimes look like. These are designed in a way that many UN agencies have raised grave concern because they do not agree that these standards of living are actually compatible with Article 11 of the Covenant on Social and Cultural Rights that sort of gives us all the right to adequate housing and living standard. The right to adequate housing includes freedom to be free from arbitrary interference. So this basically means that your landlord cannot just jump into your bedroom when he or she feels to do that. This is not something refugees in these asylum seekers' houses can this is not a right they have. We all have a right to privacy and family. Refugees in these accommodation centers don't have this right. And we all are entitled to a minimum form of participation. Refugees do not have this right as long as they live in these accommodation centers, because these accommodation centers are usually people who share rooms with strangers. This is sort of decided by the management and the accommodation facilities, and a person is allowed to have 7 square meters per person, bathroom and kitchen included. So it's really nothing. In Berlin, we have an airport, a former airport, where 2,000 people, I believe, are living. So this is far from being anything that is adequate to a proper way of living. Common bathrooms and kitchens are a reality. Many of these accommodations are in very remote areas with very little infrastructure and poor connectivity. And especially in East Germany, many of these asylum seekers' houses are in very, very racist communities. The school I work for is in a district where 23.4% voted for an extreme right party on the 18th of September, and this is also a community where many asylum seekers are forced to live in. There is surveillance of the entrance, there is very, very problematic security forces in the building, and we have arbitrary quarantines. So this is just a little bit of an idea of how these accommodation houses look like. About other cultural and social rights, we all have the right to health. And the right to health actually means not only absence of being ill. Yeah? So the right to health is much more, and it basically defined as the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. That's what the UN has defined. Refugees in Germany fall under the scope of the so-called Asylbewerberleistungsgesetz. Basically, it means Asylum Seekers Benefit Act. That means that the state only pays for healthcare and illness that is very necessary and acute and causes pain. Everything else is considered irrelevant. So you can only go to a doctor if it is very acute, if it's very painful, and if it cannot be postponed for the time where you're supposed to be in your country of origin. We all have a right to work. Refugees in Germany are not allowed to work for the first 9 months at all, and after that it's theoretically possible, but practically nearly impossible. The implication is that many refugees obviously need money, and they are working in very exploitative working conditions, and sometimes actually we are talking about trafficking or slavery-like working conditions. So we have a law that actually sort of structurally enables people or forces people to work under working conditions that are far from being fair and safe. So, just to sum it up, social workers here are working in a field where the human rights of their clients are being constantly violated. Social workers can sometimes be part of the system that violates these rights. The other part is that the clients are so structurally vulnerable. It is really interesting. In Germany, you cannot open a kindergarten without a proper complaint mechanism. But you can open an airport with 2,000 asylum seekers living there with no complaint mechanism whatsoever. So people who are living there have no possibility to complain about what is happening to them towards any authority. Many of these accommodation centers have no concept to protect women, kids, LGBTIQ, and other vulnerable groups. I'm not saying that violence is a bigger issue in these houses than somewhere else, but obviously violence is also an issue in these houses. Many of these people who live there, and sort of the management side has no concept whatsoever on protection. On the other hand, for social workers, this is a field that is very uncalculable. People are being deported. So for example, a social worker who actually talked to a family yesterday evening might come today morning to his or her workplace, and the whole family is deported. There are new laws, there are relocations, very bad working conditions, and something went wrong there, sorry. Just to give you an idea, I asked social workers in the field, how many people are you actually in charge of? And one said he's in charge of 150 clients, which is totally ridiculous. Doing professional social work, being in charge of 150 people who have just arrived to Germany is not possible. And the sad side of the story is that I don't understand why people don't complain. Because these days to get a job as a social worker in the field of asylum seekers is not an issue. You will get a job. That is really not a problem. So I really fail to understand how people agree to look after 150 people knowing they will not be able to do so. So it is a very interesting field to look at. So what I mean when I talk about human rights as a frame of reference, to just give you a few ideas of the concerns I'm really worried about these days. We have this idea that, or actually I have reason to believe that social workers who are working with refugees are concentrating more than they should on the mandate from the state. You remember we talked about 3 mandates, so the mandate from the service provider, the mandate from the state, and the third mandate. So obviously you have to keep all 3 in mind, but I have reason to believe that many social workers are concentrating more than they should on the mandate from the state. It is very unclear to me how actually social workers are reacting if somebody is asking for something, so a service provider is asking for something, that is in contradiction to what the agency has told the social worker to do. So for example, do social workers assist people to find flats? We have many asylum seekers who have the right to live in a flat, but we know from many housings that the social workers don't assist them because their employers have told them not to do so. Because as long as people are living in the houses, they get money. It's a per head fee. Yeah, this has nothing to do with the mandate of social work. Do they denounce people who went in hiding in order to escape deportation? Yeah, we know that there have been some cases. Do they provide state with information that is harmful to their clients, for example, nationalities? Because if the nationality of a person is unclear, the person is not deportable. As a social worker, I might have an idea whom this person talked to in a language that was sort of a mutual language. So I might have an idea where this person comes from. Do I provide this information to the state or do I not? And do I provide assistance for deportation? I mean, this is a crazy idea. I hope we all can agree on that. But I have a sort of a checklist somebody sent me from Hessen, that's in central Germany, where the deportation office actually has a checklist they send to social workers in order to prepare deportations. And they were supposed to fill inside, so it was basically family so-and-so is to be deported. Do you think they will go in hiding? If yes, where do you think they will hide? Do you think NGOs will support them? If yes, which NGOs? Do these people have mobile phones? Which are the numbers? I mean, this is ridiculous. That the state has this idea, okay, but that social workers actually think about filling up this checklist is a problem we need to deal and talk about. So, to just give you a few other not so bad examples, we have the situation of arbitrary room controls, that social workers have a general key to the places where people live. And I have heard from many, many refugees and many social workers that these rooms are controlled without any reason with the key. The right to participation of people is being totally denied in many, many asylum seekers' houses. Again, this is a big problem if you're talking about the human right to adequate housing. This is a question, not a question, this is sort of something a social worker told me, that the place he works, that the employer said, you are allowed to give food, but you're only allowed to give food if the refugee asks for it in German. Yeah? A social worker is supposed to distribute food only if the person asks for it in German. This is a funny sort of a situation. This is a student of mine who did a research on it, and he found out that a social worker told him he's supposed to count sugar cubes because the employer does not want to spend too much money on sugar, so he sort of decided 3 sugar cubes per refugee per day, and the social worker is supposed to sit and count sugar in Berlin. Yeah? Toilet paper is also not sort of something we all are entitled to, apparently. In one place, toilet paper was only given out if the refugees asked for it politely. So these are all issues I think we need to sort of talk about human dignity, because combining needs like toilet paper, sugar, and food, and sort of connecting that to any sort of condition is a big issue. These are small examples, but what lies above that is a big issue, because human dignity is something we all have, and we all have the right that our dignities are protected. We know that sometimes social workers are reporting absences to the authorities, and this ends up with the reduction of the money that the asylum seekers get at the end of the month. So again, we have an issue with the right to adequate standard of living. So these are a few examples, and I think the list can be longer and longer, but I hope you get an understanding of what exactly I mean. So how do social workers actually deal with these demands? The bad news is that some of them actively agree to them. Some of them just somehow fulfill these demands. Some feel uncomfortable and try to avoid them somehow. Some of them secretly resist. But there are very few cases in which demands that were not compatible with the mandate of social work have actually been actively contradicted, for example, with applying the International Code of Ethics or human rights. And that is, I think, a really sad story, that there are very little cases where social workers go to their employers and say, I refuse to count sugar in a country like Germany where sugar is freely available and really not expensive. Yeah? I refuse to do this because this has nothing to do with the mandate of social work. I refuse to give food connected to a condition. There are very few cases where this is actually happened. We have very little cases of whistleblowing, public awareness work, and strategic litigations on these issues. But I have one good story to share, and I think I can take a few minutes on that. We had a very interesting case of whistleblowing 6 weeks ago. Those of you who are in Germany might have read it in the newspaper. There's an asylum seekers house very close to our university. A very problematic management was sort of in this house, PWB, and there were many, many complaints, and it was very difficult to get rid of this management. Then we found out that the director of this house was a former candidate of a Nazi party. That was not enough to get rid of this person or this firm. Then somebody whistleblowed. Somebody made public emails that went between the director of this house and somebody else. And they were sort of fantasizing about spending money on a guillotine for children. And it's getting even worse. That was not enough. And because this would create a big mess, the next fantasy was, well, we would have a guillotine, is that the right word? Something that kills children? Guillotine? Okay, whatever, I guess you know. And sort of to get rid of the mess, they were sort of fantasizing to build up a crematorium that would also help the heating problem. So these are sort of people who are allowed to have the responsibility of 600 migrants. So this was a very interesting case of whistleblowing. I honestly don't know who the person was, but somebody put these emails public, and that finally was information enough to get rid of this firm. And is an example how whistleblowing can be helpful. So maybe we have further ideas of how to go on for this. As I mentioned before, if you see social work as a human rights profession, social work is a political stakeholder, but I have news on silence of a very political stakeholder. For example, in Germany, racist exclusions, and this is again the other Germany, it's not the Merkel Germany. Till 2012, in Germany, asylum seekers received only 60% of social aid money from the state. Our constitutional court decided that this is a violation of human dignity and therefore against the constitution. That was 2012. In 2015, the same government, not the same government, the government decided to reduce social aid money for people who are refugees up to 40%. So basically the state has sort of decided to ignore something that our constitutional court decided 3 years ago. Nothing from the side of the profession. Albania, Kosovo, and Montenegro have been declared to be safe countries of origin. This is totally ridiculous because at the same hand, German military is in Kosovo because Kosovo is so dangerous. So these countries have been considered safe countries of origin, nothing from our side. Asylum seekers can be forced to stay in first accommodations up to 6 months. Deportations are now possible without prior announcements, and minors can and will be distributed amongst sort of all places in Germany. All this happened on an institutional level, very little news from the profession. On the discursive level, and this is something that is really worrying me, that the frame of what can be said has been expanded towards the right, and social work is part of the system. We have a renaissance of what is we and the others. Yeah, it's very clear. It's a very clear we is white Germany and the others are the rest. So it's a bit like the West and the rest. We have a total renaissance of culturalization. Actually, working on the issue of migration for many years, we had already reached a step further. We've gone 10 steps back. We have a craziness on integration instead of inclusion. We were actually talking about inclusion, and integration was really 80s. Now it's come back. A lot of discourses where state security and asylum are being entangled, violence against women and asylum is being entangled, and very absurd ideas are coming up like people can lose their right on asylum. You remember, the right on asylum is a human right. How can you lose a human right? But we have serious politicians actually openly debating these things. We have people saying we need limits, which is a very interesting picture. I mean, if you have a limit of 200,000, what does this mean to 200, 2001? Yeah? What is it if it's a couple? What about the human rights of everybody who's sort of beyond this limit? And we've had discussions about deportation of criminals without a fair trial. Germany has a history of non-fair trials, so it's even more problematic to honestly debate that people should be deported without a fair trial. So the role of social work is a problematic one. What are we actually doing? Why are we so quiet? And why are we not positioning ourselves in these debates? And sort of this is basically a question, are we actually contributing to these racist exclusions? I'm not quite sure. I sometimes feel that we are actually contributing to this discourses. So to sum it up and to come to an end, obviously we have responsibilities. I'll start with the responsibilities of people from the field, and I'll end with my responsibilities, or our responsibilities. I really wish that people who are working the field would focus more on human rights abuses in countries of destination. So what is happening to refugees in Germany? We saw all the pictures of Africa, of Jordan, of Iraq. I could have shown you pictures of bathrooms and houses in Berlin, which you would not imagine that people are forced to live in. So why are we concentrating on states that are so far away? I would like to concentrate more on what the situation is here. A clear understanding of mandate. What is my mandate? What is my understanding? A clear refusal of unethical demands. More lobby work, more strategic litigation, more whistleblowing, more public awareness, more political work on these issues. I do hope that we will also contribute to sort of implement effective complaint mechanism for service providers. This can mean they would also complain against us, but I think if you're talking about human rights, we also have to be very, very self-critical. So this would be the responsibility of, from people in the field, and obviously also universities have responsibilities, and I hope that we will contribute more to enable students and practitioners to deal with all these things. We need an expansion of methods that are taught in social work. I cannot ask people in the field to do more whistleblowing, lobby work, and not teach how to do it. So basically our responsibility is to enable people to do it, and I hope people will pick it up. Our responsibility is also to enable students and practitioners to work in accordance with human rights, to support people in conflictive situations, a very clear understanding of what is actually mandate of social work, and encourage a debate on unethical social work, and obviously we will also contribute to complaint mechanisms. You all have found this. Yes, this picture. This is basically a position paper, and I'll end up with that. This is something we did this year because we had many complaints from the field, and this is a position paper on how social work, according to us, could be, can be, should be in the field of social work that is human rights oriented with refugees. Thank you very much.